Lady Death is the gripping memoir of Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the most lethal female sniper in history. Dive into the harrowing and heroic account of a young Soviet woman who became a legend during World War II with 309 confirmed kills. Let's begin. The medics handed me the mortar splinter. It looked like a blackened, flat piece of metal, slightly longer than a matchstick, with sharp, jagged edges. Had its trajectory been lower, I do not know what would have happened to me. I would probably be lying with a hole in my head in the damp earth of a cemetery near the village of Tatarka, like 150 of my regimental comrades in arms, along with our courageous company commander, Lieutenant Voronin, and Private Bazarbayev from my platoon, an excellent shot and a good man. We buried them late in the evening of October 11th, when the battle had died down and the Romanians had withdrawn to their earlier positions. I have little recollection of how the operation went, but my appearance after it was far from military. Half my hair had been shorn, my skin had been daubed with brilliant green antiseptic, and after the splinter had been extricated, the wound had been stitched and my head bandaged. When the morphine stopped working, the pain came on again. I felt it in my temples, in the back of my head, and in the place where the splinter had been removed. I began to suffer from extreme dizziness. The surgeon said that there could be no question of an immediate return to the regiment. I would have to spend 10 to 12 days with the medical battalion. However, I fell into the category of walking patients. Within a day, on October 15th, I was allowed to go out for a stroll. I thrust my arms into my overcoat sleeves, stuck a peaked cap on my bandaged head, and set off to view the surroundings and breathe some fresh air. On October 14th, the sun had still been shining brightly in the blue sky and warming the steppe expanses around Odessa with its rays. But on the 15th, the warm, crystal-clear, black sea autumn suddenly came to an end. The horizon was enveloped by low, leaden-colored clouds, and a cold northerly wind began to blow. Soon the first drops of rain fell on the borders and paths of the homely gardens that surrounded the rural school. The 47th Medical Battalion was comfortably set up in its building, which was a stroke of luck. Army medical units were more often situated in fields or forests in large canvas tents. Here the wounded were triaged, operated on, and brought back to health. The severely wounded with amputations, burns, and broken bones were dispatched deep into the rear in ambulances. As they left the school, I would observe the stretchers bearing them, being loaded onto a couple of 1.5-ton vehicles with red crosses on the sides. They took the road for Odessa, where seagoing transport ships awaited them in the port. The war had still not reached the rural school, but distant cannon fire, roaring away somewhere in the west and southwest, reminded us of it. To judge from the mighty racket, the firing came from our own coastal batteries and long-range ordnance on the ships of the Black Sea Fleet. Sometimes the chorus was joined by cannon of smaller caliber from 2 armored trains that bombarded the fascist lines after approaching to within close range of them. The fallen leaves rustled under my feet. The bushes of wild rose and dogwood had completely lost their foliage of late, and the thin black twigs now stretched up forlornly to the sky. The juniper was like a green wall, afraid of neither the wind nor the rain. In the borders where gladioli, tulips, and roses grew, the soil was dark brown. In spite of the bombing raids and artillery shelling, someone was looking after the garden and had dug it over a day or two ago. The determination and industry of people who refused to accept the chaos of wartime commanded respect. I picked up a curled, dry, crimson yellow leaf and tried to straighten it with my fingers. The leaf would not yield. Its life was over. A khaki-colored general's car entered the garden through the open gates and drove towards the school. It was the kind of vehicle in which Major General Petrov usually rode. I went up to the drive and stood at attention, raising my hand to my cap. The Gorky manufactured Gaz M1, known colloquially as MK, stopped almost beside me. It was indeed the commander of the coastal army, Ivan Petrov, who stepped out of it and turned to me. Lyudmila, what are you doing here? I'm under treatment, comrade. Major General. A head wound? He walked up to me. Yes, comrade Major General. Was it long ago? No, it was on October 13th with the 1st Battalion by the village of Tatarka. We were beating off an attack by the Romanian infantry and a mortar splinter. Why don't you wear a helmet, girl? The Major General asked sternly. It was an accident, Ivan Yefimovich. Are you being treated well? Petrov inquired. Excellently, I responded. Well, get ready to move now, Lyuda. We're off to Sevastopol, by sea. But what about our dear city of Odessa, Ivan Yefimovich? I could not refrain from expressing my grief. Surely we are not going to surrender it to the fascists to be plundered and defiled. They'll raze it to the ground. That's the order from the Supreme Command, Lyudmila. In an apparent attempt to comfort me, Petrov brushed my shoulder with his hand in a fatherly way. You realize that it's the duty of a soldier always to carry out orders to the letter. My orders to you are not to mope, have faith in victory, and fight bravely. By the way, how many enemies have you got in your tally now? 187. You are simply a champion, the Major General exclaimed in sincere admiration. You're shooting well. Well, they attack in dense ranks, the idiots, I said, thinking that Petrov was expecting an explanation for the situation. It's even difficult to miss them. Since being appointed to the lofty post of Commander-in-Chief of the Coastal Army, Ivan Yefimovich had not changed at all. He remained the same modest, calm, and reserved man, and thought not so much about the power over people this position imbued him with as about his responsibility for them. He was bearing an onerous task at that time, evacuating all military units from Odessa to Sevastopol by sea. It had to be arranged in a very short time frame and kept secret from the enemy, preventing them from pursuing our departing regiments. He spent whole days in a car traveling up and down the lines of the Odessa Defense District, checking how preparations for the operation were going in the different army units. His face was now weary and grey from road dust, but he took my words as a joke, and he liked it. The general's eyes flashed with a mischievous sparkle. He laughed. Well, Lyuda, with soldiers like you, there is nothing to fear, said Petrov. We'll cross the sea and defend the Crimea. Everything will be fine, you'll see. With hurried footsteps, Petrov headed for the school, and I remained in the garden, reflecting on the news I had just heard. To be honest, I could not get my head around it. We, the defenders of Odessa, had held our firing lines, and never considered retreat. We remained confident that the Supreme Command in Moscow would not issue such an order, but, just as before, send the city reinforcements, weapons, ammunition, equipment, and provisions. Since August 1941, embattled Odessa had found itself in the enemy rear and been an example of staunch, heroic resistance to the German and Romanian invaders in that difficult period when German divisions were speeding towards the capital of our homeland. At that time, we were still unaware that very soon, within 8 days, we would receive the decision of the Supreme Command requiring us to abandon Odessa and evacuate the army to the Crimea, which the fascist hordes were already threatening to seize, having reached the approaches to Perekop. Major General F.N. Voronin, a member of the Coastal Army's Military Council, recalled later. Perhaps because the tense struggle with the enemy at the Odessa base had to some extent shielded us from events on other fronts, this decision was staggeringly unexpected for us. He had to resolve the question of organizing the withdrawal of forces from battle and the evacuation of the army. By that time, the personnel of the Staff Operational Section had made the suggestion: could the forces not be removed from the defense lines straight away rather than in gradual stages, as had been assumed until now? Petrov approved this idea. I supported him in this. Staff headquarters was ordered to rework the evacuation plan. The Military Council of the Odessa Defense District affirmed the new plan based on all forces withdrawing from Odessa simultaneously. In terms of actual military formations, it amounted to around 50,000 troops. They were all faced with loading onto transports along with their weapons and departing Odessa in one night, October 16th. This plan was brilliantly implemented, and in the history of the Great War for the fatherland, it stands as a logistical operation of unique complexity. After sunset on October 15th, 1941, the regiments and batteries of 3 rifle divisions, the 25th, 95th, and 421st, and 1 cavalry division, began to leave their firing lines, form into columns in total silence, and depart through the city for the port, so that they would not get lost in the dark and take a wrong turning at street corners or intersections. Directions were scrawled there with powdered lime and chalk. The rear guard battalions remained in their trenches for another 2 hours, maintaining diversionary fire at the enemy from machine guns and mortars, and then withdrew themselves. Their place on the front line was taken by teams of scouts and by local partisans who carried on as if the infantry were still there. They lit campfires, fired from time to time, and moved around the communication passages. The Romanians and Germans made no attempt to attack and cross the front line. The 47th Medical Battalion was loaded onto road transport and took its place within its own Chapayev division, following immediately behind the Sapper Battalion. The road was considerably damaged, which made it impossible to travel at high speed. Nevertheless, we drove through the outskirts of Odessa in an hour. In the city itself, the traffic was even slower. The streets were jammed with abandoned army trucks and lines of carts carrying a variety of military equipment. A particularly large bottleneck developed by the main gates of the port, the Custom House gates, which gave onto Custom House Square. The troops and officers of the 54th Regiment had last passed along the streets of Odessa at the end of September. I saw that the situation was significantly worse now. The autumn twilight enshrouded the streets, squares, parks, and boulevards of the city, but the destruction caused by enemy aircraft still stood out, especially in the city center. Many buildings were without roofs or second and third stories. With black holes in place of windows, they looked out sadly at their defenders, who were now leaving them. The route of the 25th Division lay through the main streets of the Central Port District, from Transandre's Figuration Square via Greek Square, and then a turn into Polski Spask to Custom House Square. When our column halted yet one more time at an intersection blocked by some artillery wagon, I saw on the left side of the street the two-story building of the district enlistment office, or rather what was left of it after a bomb had dropped on it. Not that long ago I had gone there to join the Red Army as a volunteer, and the weary military registrar had explained to me that the army was no place for women. In a safe there had been my passport with the registration stamp of my marriage to A.B. Pavlichenko. Then he disappeared in the fiery crucible of war, and I was able to forget about my stupid youthful escapade. No safe, no passport, only soot-blackened walls, only collapsed beams, only the twisted remains of the iron staircase, which I had once ascended to the office where my fate was decided. While our ambulance stood at the crossroads, narrow roads, I contemplated the ruins of the enlistment office. Without a doubt, the war had had a sort of magical impact on my life. I had been intending to be a school history teacher or a research assistant in a library or archive. Instead, I had become a frontliner sniper, a skillful hunter of people dressed in Romanian and German uniforms. Why had those people come here, onto my land? Why had they forced me to give up my peacetime profession? In the late October evening, the Odessa seaport, the biggest on the coast, with its 5 kilometers of well-built modern quays, thriving port economy, and cargo turnover of apparently over 10 million tons a year, recalled the biblical city of Babylon, as it endured its last hours before its great catastrophe. Thousands and thousands of people in military uniform were crowding its territory. There were army trucks, tractor units pulling heavy howitzers, tanks, armored vehicles, mobile kitchens, horse-drawn carts, and saddle horses belonging to the troops and officers of the 2nd Cavalry Division. At first glance, it appeared that chaos reigned, but the personnel of the Odessa naval base displayed the highest degree of organization as the forces were being loaded. The army columns pouring into the port area proceeded quickly via roads that had been worked out earlier, onto the quays, to the ships of the Black Sea Steamer Service and the Black Sea Fleet, which had been designated to transport specific military units. For instance, Vitas Chapayevs squeezed through the custom house gates and headed for the Platonov and new piers in the new harbor. At the quays were the cargo motor vessels Jean Jaurès, Kursk, and Ukraina. The boarding began. Along gangways lowered from the ships, 1,000 soldiers climbed onto their decks every 45 minutes, 2,000 every hour and a half. Machine guns and small regimental mortars of 50 mm caliber went up the same gangways. Cannons and anti-aircraft guns on wooden pallets awaited their turn on the pier. They could only be taken on board by the loading derricks of the motor vessels, which were working non-stop. Until now, I had never made a trip by sea or been on a ship. I wanted to have a good look at everything, but the embarkation, which was taking place at a truly furious tempo, got in the way. The Janshorse, on which our medical battalion was loaded along with the headquarters staff of the 25th Division and some of its other units, including the 69th Artillery Regiment, the 99th Howitzers, and the 193rd Anti-Aircraft Battery, loomed before me like a long, tall, black wall rising sheer over the quay. Above it hung a white superstructure with lifeboats and a thick funnel on which was painted a red strip bearing a yellow hammer and sickle. On the bridge stood the captain, a big, broad-shouldered man in a black maritime peaked cap with a golden crest above the peak. He directed all the wounded into the crew mess room. At his command, the road vehicles and howitzers were lowered into the Nampaster 1 and Nampaster 2 in the holds at the bow end of the ship. He left 4 anti-aircraft cannons on the upper deck, supposing with good reason that they would come in handy in fighting off German air attacks during the crossing from Odessa to Sevastopol. In the crew mess room, I managed to get a place by a big porthole, from which almost the entire new harbor was visible. The turmoil on the pier was gradually coming to an end. The forces were crossing from the shore onto the ships, the 3 motor vessels, Janshorse, Kursk, and Ukraina, each with a cargo capacity of 5,000 or 6,000 tons, were accommodating personnel and machinery on their decks and in their holds according to the plan. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening of October 15th, 1941, the tugs began to lead our cargo vessel away from the wharf. Then the ship's diesel engine started up. The Janshorse shuddered and began to move out into the open sea. It was surrounded by impenetrable gloom. The port of Odessa was drifting into the distance, a scarlet and yellow dot. The huge portside warehouses were on fire. There was evidently nobody to extinguish them and no reason to. We were abandoning the city to the foe, but we had no doubt that we would return. After breakfast the next morning, I went up to the top deck. There was a light wind blowing, and the rocking was almost imperceptible. The sun peered out from behind the clouds, and its rays began to glide along the small waves, giving rise to bright white flashes. The infinite ocean plain spread out on both sides of the Janshorse. The Odessa shore had disappeared like a mirage in the desert. Leaning my shoulder against the metal wall of a part of the ship's superstructure, I protected myself against the wind with the flap of my overcoat, pulled the silver cigarette case out of my pocket, clicked the lighter, and inhaled the slightly bitter smoke. The trophy cigarette case was all that remained as a memento of Lieutenant Andrei Voronin. Those unforgettable battles were over, at Blayaevka, at Gildendorf, and at Tatarka. Each of them had contributed a grain of army experience, taught me something. Soldiers' ingenuity, patience, and tenacity, one might say. But not only that, I had gained an understanding of what human beings were like in war. My reflections were interrupted by a menacing shout from above. "Comrade, it is only permitted to smoke on board in designated areas." "Can you tell me where?" I asked, raising my head. Leaning on the bars of the captain's bridge and looking down at me was the navigating officer, the 3rd mate, a man of about 30 in a naval leather jacket and a black forage cap. His face was at first very stern. He was probably intending to dish out a good telling off to an idle landlubber, that is, me. But the sailor had not expected that someone in a soldier's overcoat and forage cap with a bandaged head might be a woman. First he fell silent in embarrassment, then he smiled and, in a completely different, more polite tone, said, "There's a place on the quarterdeck at the stern." "No, I'm not going there." I took a last drag and threw the unfinished cigarette overboard. "Are you from the hospital?" The sailor continued to examine me. "Yes, from the medical battalion." "And where were you wounded?" "In the battle at Tatarka." "Carrying out the wounded under fire?" he inquired, probably having no idea that women in the army could take part in military engagements on the same level as men. "Sort of." I shrugged my shoulders, having no intention of telling him about my service as a sniper. "Do you want to look at our convoy through binoculars?" The navigator clearly wanted to continue the acquaintance. "Climb up the gangplank. From here you can see almost all the ships." The sailor first kindly explained to me how to use binoculars. Prismatic field binoculars with 6-fold magnification are an essential item in a sniper's equipment, but I listened attentively to his explanation and asked a few questions. In fact, a medical orderly could not have been so familiar with the mechanism of such things. Finally, the binoculars ended up in my hands, and I looked through the eyepieces. The double-masted bulk of the cruiser Krasnaya Ukraina, which was painted a grey-blue color, had rapidly drawn near. It had ordnance on its prow, quite a high superstructure, 3 funnels, and 8 broadside cannon of large caliber. A powerful and beautiful ship, the real pride of the Black Sea Fleet. Nobody knew then that it would not have much longer to operate. Krasnaya Ukraina and the cruiser Krasnaya Kavkaz were sailing ahead of us, clearly delineated against the background of the blue sky. Cruisers could work up a speed of 30 knots, but on the morning of October 16th they were moving at a third of that speed, adjusting to the pace of the other ships in the convoy. The destroyers Bodry and Smishlayoni, 3 minesweepers, 2 gunboats, and 1 patrol boat protected the large transports like our Jan Zores, and also Ukraina, Kursk, Kalinin, Kotovskoy, and Vasily Chapayev. While I was viewing the ships through the binoculars, the navigator was briefly describing them, their displacements, power units, and dimensions. He spoke about his beloved Jan Zores with special fascination. I learned a lot of interesting things. For instance, that the motor vessel was built in Leningrad at the Northern Shipbuilding Dock in 1931 as one of 4 similar ships, and then made a voyage around Europe because it was attached to the Black Sea Company. In 1934, the Jan Zores had brought the celebrated writer Maxim Gorky and his family from Genoa to the Soviet Union. Then it went to New York and carried various cargoes to Italy, France, and Batumi in the Caucasus. This highly informative chat on the bridge concluded with an invitation to a cup of tea in the mess and getting to know each other. The sailor's name was Konstantin Podima, and he was born in the city of Novorossiysk, except that we did not have time for tea. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, while the convoy was passing by the Tilstendras spit, it was attacked by a group of enemy bombers. However, our ships were covered by several pairs of I-150, 3, I-16 and Yak-1 fighters. They boldly rushed out to meet the German twin-engine Junkers 88S and the single-engine Junkers 87 dive bombers, or trundlers, as we call them on account of their clumsy-looking fixed undercarriage. there began a real aerial cavalcade of flying and roaring aircraft, accompanied by the crackle of machine gun rounds, anti-aircraft salvos, and bombs exploding as the Fritzes dropped them into the sea. At risk of being hit by their own fire, our Yastrebki prevented them from carrying out precision bombing and also joined battle with German Messerschmitt 109 fighters, which were defending the heavy, sluggish bombers. One fragment of this battle was played out right beside our ship. A Junkers 87 shot down by an accurate round of fire from a red-starred Yastreb, began to smoke, went into a steep dive, and splashed flat into the water about 10 meters away from our ship. However, it did not immediately sink into the watery depths. I thought I saw the face of the pilot distorted by a grimace of horror. The wave that arose from the aircraft's landing rocked the Jean Zors strongly on the right, but the ship, which was more than 100 meters long, quickly corrected itself. The crew greeted the victory of the Soviet pilot with a loud and harmonious shout of "Hurrah!" While I was observing the maneuvers of a dozen yellow-nosed trundlers with black crosses on their wings and fuselages, swooping down on the ships and flying at 200-300 meters above them, I remembered my rifle in its case in the Jean Zores crew mess hall. It had been my cherished desire ever since our sad retreat along the roads of Bessarabia, when, before our eyes, the fascists shot peaceful civilians with impunity, to shoot down one of these vultures with my rifle. However, at that time I did not have even an ordinary Mosin rifle. Firing at moving targets is the hardest part of frontline territory service for snipers. The difficulty lies not only in making ballistic calculations quickly and precisely, but one also needs to have good skills in working with a mobile rifle. The weapon should be pointed not at the target, but in front of it, calculating the time and distance to the point where both moving objects, the bullet and the target, will meet. This method is termed deflection shooting, and we had studied it at sniper school. Potapov told us that at the end of 1915, his regiment had shot down a low-flying German Fokker with a rifle. It is essential to know the speed at which the target is moving, judging from everything around us. I estimated that the Junkers 87 dive bombers were swooping down to drop their bombs at a speed of at least 400 kilometers per hour. But the Jean Zors was not standing still. It was traveling quite quickly and maneuvering as well to dodge the fascist attacks. 4 anti-aircraft cannons on the ship's deck maintained almost continuous fire, and the Fritzes frequently turned away from their target. I could only admire the bold actions of the vessel's crew. The aerial attack did not bring the Germans success. They were not able to sink a single ship, and our red-starred Yastrebki shot down more than 15 bombers. The ship's anti-aircraft cannons put a further 3 fascists into the water. But our own pilots also perished in this battle. The sailors managed to save 3 wounded flyers from aeroplanes that had been brought down. In the afternoon, another group of enemy aircraft appeared in the sky over the convoy. About 40 Junkers 87 and Junkers 88 bombers. Up to meet them went our fighters, which were based at the aerodromes in the Crimea and on Tendraspit, 56 warplanes in all. Once again we witnessed the dramatic sight of an aerial battle. in the course of which the enemy once again failed to achieve their goals. Only later in the evening did the Germans manage to wipe out the old transport Bolshevik, which was at the tail of the convoy. A torpedo hit it and the ship sank, but the entire crew of the motor vessel, which had succeeded in lowering its lifeboats, were picked up by Soviet minesweepers and torpedo boats. The convoy arrived at Sevastopol on October 17, 1941, at 7 o'clock in the evening and moored in Strelets Bay. Unloading began. Having been relieved from his watch, Konstantin Podima came out to escort me and saw to his amazement that, apart from my kit bag, I was carrying over my shoulder a long object in a cover. The gallant sailor immediately offered his assistance. I replied that I could not hand over my personal weapon to anyone. "Surely you don't carry a weapon, Lyuda?" he asked incredulously. "A sniper rifle," I confessed. "So you're not a medic? You're a rifleman? I would never have thought—" "Why, Kostya?" "There's no place for women in war," he said with conviction. I had neither the time nor the desire to argue with the navigator. During the dreadful war in which our people were fighting for their very survival, everyone who was confident in military knowledge and skills, regardless of his or her sex or national affiliation, had to join the ranks and make whatever contribution they were capable of to wipe out the German fascist invaders. Only then would we be able to defeat the enemy. This concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Pavlichenko's story? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.